Hello, I'm Clayton Callahan. I'm 33 years old. Today I'm in the middle of a serene cemetery in Nashville, Tennessee, where a cold autumn wind seems to tangle in my fingers and sweep me away. Next to me stands 13-year-old Max, a boy with dark gray eyes. Every time I look into those eyes, the past comes flooding back. Tiffany, my daughter Isa, and those days when I believed happiness was eternal. We stand at two graves, one large, the other small. Their names are deeply engraved on the stones. Tiffany Callahan, my wife, Isa Callahan, my daughter, two lives gone from me, leaving behind voids impossible to fill. I don't say much, and neither does Max. He clutches Isa's favorite toy, an old worn rag doll, tightly in his hands. Time has blurred and worn the doll's plastic eyes, but Max clings to it as if it were the last thing that still connects him to his sister. I leave a bouquet of white daisies on Tiffany's grave. Its delicate leaves tremble softly in the wind, as if whispering something I can't hear. Max leans down and places it at the foot of baby Jesus' gravestone. His movements are slow, almost sacredly reverent. I see his shoulders shake slightly, but he doesn't cry. Max never cries in my presence. Perhaps he feels he needs to stay strong, just as I try to hide the pain in my heart. There's an unusual peace in the cemetery today. The rows of maple trees glow a vibrant yellow, their leaves drifting slowly, weaving a carpet of red and orange beneath our feet. The clear chirping of birds in the distance deepens my sense of emptiness. I look at Max, with his messy brown hair and cheeks flushed from the cold. He's all I have left. And he's living proof of the promise I once made to Tiffany, a promise I gave everything to keep, even though the price was far heavier than I could have ever imagined. I don't know where to begin this story. Maybe from those early days when everything was bright as the summer sun, or maybe from that moment when I realized life was never fair, when everything fell apart. But as I stand before these two graves, I know that Tiffany was the beginning of everything. The woman who remade me, who gave me a world and then took it all away, leaving behind only one last piece. I met Tiffany more than 10 years ago on an October afternoon. Golden sunlight filtered through the crimson maple trees on my college campus. I was a senior in civil engineering, standing awkwardly in a corner in a cheap suit at a charity event for orphans. A friend had forced me to come, but I didn't really care. That is, until Tiffany walked onto the stage. She wore a pale blue dress, her brown hair was pulled back, and her gray eyes shone like a lake in the sun. Her voice was clear and strong, yet also filled with emotion as she spoke of her childhood. She had grown up in the foster system, drifting from home to home, feeling nowhere to belong. "I was once a child no one cared about," she said, and her sad smile stabbed me in the chest like a knife. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. There was something about Tiffany that both filled me with sorrow and admiration. She possessed a quiet resilience, as if she had learned to get back up without needing anyone's help every time she fell. When the event ended, I mustered up all the courage I could muster to talk to her. I don't remember what ridiculous thing I said, only that she laughed, and that smile made me forget the world around me. We started seeing each other often. We'd take short coffee breaks between classes, walk around campus on cooler evenings, our breaths mingling in the dim light of the streetlights. Tiffany rarely talked about her past. When I asked, she'd smile and give short answers. "I lived with 7 different families until I was 18, she'd said once, sitting on a wooden bench by the lake. No one would want a boy like me for long. Maybe I wasn't cute enough." She smiled, but I saw her eyes mist over, as if hiding an old wound. I wanted to tell her she was cuter than anyone I'd ever known, that I was the one who would keep her by my side forever. But instead, I took her hand, squeezed it gently, and in that moment, I realized how much I loved her. There was something about Tiffany that pushed me to be the best version of myself. Not because he demanded it, but because I believed his sincerity meant life could be even better than I'd ever imagined. After graduation, we moved to a small apartment on the outskirts of Nashville. It had a single bedroom, and its window looked out onto a street lined with oak trees. The walls were crumbling, the faucet dripping, but we didn't care. We had each other, and that was enough to make it a home. I worked for a small construction company and often came home dusty and smelling of wood. Tiffany was a preschool teacher, and every evening she told stories about the children she loved. "Little Joey drew me a picture today," she'd say, her eyes sparkling. "It was a house with a whole family standing in front of it. I think she wants a real home, too." I'd hug her from behind and whisper, "You'd give those kids the world if you could." We were married a year later. The ceremony was held in a small park in the shade of a large oak tree. Tiffany wore a simple white dress. Her hair was natural and loose. I'd never seen her look so beautiful. We didn't have much money, and it wasn't a fancy celebration, just my family, a few close friends, and a kindly old priest. When she said yes, my heart almost stopped. At that moment, I thought this was the pinnacle of happiness. There could never be a better moment. Then Isa entered our lives like a gift from heaven. She emerged on a spring morning with sunlight streaming through the hospital window and illuminating the room. When the nurse placed Isa in Tiffany's arms, I saw her cry for the first time. "She took my eyes," she whispered, her voice trembling. As I looked at Isa with her soft hair and those dark gray eyes, I realized my life had changed irrevocably. We named her Isa, meaning island, because she was our little world, our safe haven amidst the waves of life. The years that followed were the most peaceful of my life. Every morning, I would wake to Isa's laughter and the smell of Tiffany's coffee brewing in the kitchen. Isa was growing like a breeze, intelligent, joyful, and filled with an endless curiosity about the world. Tiffany was an incredible mother. She devoted her entire heart to Isa. Every night she would sing her lullabies and tell her fairy tales of her own making. "Once upon a time, there lived a princess in an enchanted forest," she would begin her stories. Isa, her eyes shining, would nestle into her mother's arms. I would often stand by the doorframe watching them, wondering what I had done to deserve this happiness. But even in the happiest moments, I would notice Tiffany sometimes drifting off into a trance, quieter than usual. Some nights, she would sit by the window, staring blankly out. When I asked her if she was okay, she would smile and say she was thinking about the children at her preschool. I believed her, but I had a vague uneasiness that she was hiding something from me. Then one day, everything started to change. Tiffany was growing increasingly tired. She complained of headaches, and I noticed small bruises appearing more frequently on her arms. "I must have bumped something in class," she'd say, but her voice sounded completely unconvincing. I insisted she see a doctor, and that day, sitting in the doctor's office, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. The doctor, in a voice as emotionless as if delivering a weather report, delivered the diagnosis: acute myeloid leukemia. I was breathless. Tiffany squeezed my hand so hard it hurt, but her eyes held a calm expression. "You have to be strong, Clayton," she said, her voice soft yet firm, just as it had been with Isa. For Isa. The next months were a nightmare. Tiffany fought the disease with all her might, but I could see her growing weaker every day. She still tried to smile, to tell Isa stories, but the light in her eyes was slowly fading. I did everything I could. I worked overtime to pay the hospital bills, and even though I wasn't religious at all, I prayed every night. But fate doesn't listen to what you want. Tiffany passed away on a winter morning that blanketed Nashville in a blanket of white snow. I sat by her bedside, holding her hand until the last trace of warmth left her body. Isa, who was only 2 at the time, didn't understand what had happened. I, my heart torn apart, didn't know how to comfort my little girl. I stood there in our empty apartment, once ringing with laughter. Everything was in place. Tiffany's coffee cup on the table, the storybook she'd left unfinished for Isa, but she was gone. I thought this was the worst pain I'd ever experienced, but I was sorely mistaken. Life had far harsher ways to test me. The days after Tiffany's death were like living like an empty shell. I went through each day mechanically. Change Isa's diaper, make her porridge, drop her off at daycare, go to work. But everything was automatic, as if I were trying to prove to myself that I was still alive. Isa, only 2 years old, was too young to understand where her mother had gone. She would hold my hand tightly, look up at me with her big gray eyes, and ask, "Where's Mommy, Daddy?" Every time I heard that question, my heart would break anew. I would hug her tightly and whisper, "Your mommy is in heaven, honey. She's watching over us from there." But even I couldn't believe those words. Tiffany was nowhere to be found. She had left me with a vast void I didn't know how to fill. Tiffany's funeral took place on a cold, drizzly day. It felt like all of Nashville was crying with me. Under a black umbrella, with Isa in my arms, I watched Tiffany's casket being lowered into the ground. I wanted to scream, "Why is life so cruel?" But I remained silent. Isa nestled against my chest, her tiny arms around my neck. It was as if she felt the pain I couldn't express. That night, after Isa had fallen asleep in her room, I sat on the couch and looked through Tiffany's belongings, things I hadn't dared touch. Her clothes were in the closet. Her favorite shoes were by the door. I didn't want to remove them, to erase any trace of her. But I knew if I didn't do something, I would drown in this grief. I started with an old wooden box Tiffany kept in her dresser. Inside were small trinkets, a cheap bracelet, a few photos of us, and a small brown leather notebook. I thought it was just a diary, but when I opened it, I found a sealed envelope with a shaky handwritten note to Clayton. My heart began to race. I didn't know why, but a vague sense of dread gripped me. I picked up the envelope, my fingers trembling as I tore the corner. Inside were 2 thin sheets of paper covered in handwriting. The ink was smeared in places, as if Tiffany had been crying while writing. I sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall, and began to read. "Dear Clayton," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I wasn't strong enough to stay with you and Isa. I tried, you know I tried, but I guess I wasn't resilient enough to overcome this illness. You always told me how resilient I was, but this time I lost." I had to stop to take a deep breath. Tiffany's gentle but painful voice echoed in my mind. I wiped my eyes and focused on the next lines. "There's something I never told you, Clayton. A secret I kept because I was afraid you'd look at me differently if you knew. I loved someone else before I met you. He was the first person who made me believe I was lovable, that I wasn't an abandoned child, but he wasn't like you. When he found out I was pregnant, he left me, leaving me alone with a baby I didn't know what to do with. I was only 20, hadn't graduated, had no money, no family. I had the baby, a boy, but I couldn't find the courage to keep him. I left him in an orphanage, Clayton. Just like my mother abandoned me, I abandoned my son." I gasped. The letter fell from my hand, but I couldn't find the strength to pick it up. Did she have a son? A child Tiffany had never known existed. The world seemed to be falling away from under me. I wanted to scream, "Why?" but there was no one to answer. I picked up the letter and continued reading, even though every word stabbed into my heart like a knife. "I know you're shocked, maybe angry with me, but please don't hate me. I've lived with this pain every day, and I've tried to make up for it by loving you and Isa with all my heart. But now, knowing I'm out of time, I have a request of you. Please find him. His name is Max. I left him at Holy Cross Orphanage. Please find him, Clayton, and if you can, love him just like you loved Isa. I know this is a selfish request, but I don't want my son to grow up like I did, without knowing what love means." The letter ended with, "I will love you forever." I sat there on the cold floor, the letter trembling in my hands. I didn't know what I was feeling, anger, pain, or just an endless emptiness. Tiffany had a son named Max, a part of me I never knew existed. I wanted to blame him, to ask why he hadn't told me before, but then I remembered his pensive gaze on those nights when he sat by the window. Perhaps in those moments, he was thinking about the devastating choice he'd made. For the next few days, I felt like a ghost. I looked at Isa, but my mind was constantly on Tiffany's letter. Find Max. How could I possibly find a child abandoned years ago? But every time I looked into Isa's gray eyes, I saw Tiffany, and her plea echoed in my mind. I couldn't ignore it, not because I wanted to, but because I knew Tiffany's soul would never find peace if I didn't try. I began my search. I took the letter and an old photo of Tiffany and went to Holy Cross Orphanage. A woman named Martha at the front desk looked at me with understanding eyes. "I remember Tiffany," she said softly. "She came here with a newborn baby who was sobbing when I left her." When she checked the records and confirmed it, my heart almost stopped. Tiffany had abandoned a child named Max in 2014. But then the woman shook her head. "The child was placed in a foster home 3 years ago. Then she ran away. We don't know where she is." I felt like a punch in the chest. Max had run away, a boy of only 6 or 7, alone and abandoned somewhere. I left the orphanage with a piece of paper with a few lines of information. Max's date of birth, the name of his last foster family, and a faded photograph of a thin boy with gray eyes just like Tiffany's. I placed ads and contacted charity organizations, but it was all in vain. Max felt as if the ground had opened up and he'd been buried there. I tried to focus all my attention on Isa. She was my only light. But every time I looked at her, I felt Tiffany and the weight of an unfulfilled promise weighing down on my shoulders. I didn't know if I would ever find Max, but I had to try. For Tiffany, for myself. But as I said, life tests us in the cruelest ways. I didn't know that losing Tiffany was only the beginning. A greater tragedy awaited me, and her name was Isa. 3 years had passed since Tiffany's death. Isa and I were trying to build a new life, even if it was with the crumbs of our old happiness. We had left Nashville and moved to Bozeman, Montana, hoping it would heal my broken heart. It had fresh air and majestic mountains. I found a steady job, and Isa, now 5, had become the center of my world. She was growing up fast, with curly brown hair and dark gray eyes, just like her mother. Every time Isa smiled, I saw Tiffany in her, and it was both a source of solace and pain. Our life in Bozeman was peaceful, at least from an outside perspective. Every morning, I took Isa to preschool and listened to her cheerful conversations about her friends and the pictures she drew. In the evenings, we would curl up on the couch under the warm lamplight and read together. Isa loved stories of brave princesses who adventured through the woods in search of treasure. "I want to be like that princess, Dad," she'd say, her eyes sparkling. "I'll find a treasure and bring it back to you." I'd smile and stroke her hair, but deep down, my only wish was that Isa, my one true treasure, would always be safe. I hadn't given up on finding Tiffany's son, Max. I carried his old photo in my wallet and occasionally called charity shops, but there were no leads. Every time I looked at the photo, I saw Tiffany's gray eyes and told myself I couldn't give up. But life with Isa was so intense that the promise I'd made to Tiffany sometimes receded into a corner of my mind I dared not touch. Then one day, everything fell apart. One summer afternoon, I went to pick up Isa from the preschool playground. She was running with her friends, laughing, her green dress fluttering in the wind. I stood by the fence, watching her with a tired smile. Work had been intense that day, but seeing Isa gave me the strength to endure everything. Suddenly, Isa stumbled as she took a step. I saw her collapse, clutching her chest. The children's laughter stopped and a teacher screamed. My heart pounded in my chest as I jumped over the fence. "Isa!" I knelt beside her and lifted her head. Her face was pale, her lips slightly blue, but she managed to open her eyes. "Dad, I'm tired," she whispered weakly. I picked her up and ran to my car, ignoring the panicked looks around me. I had only one thought. No, it couldn't be Isa. Please, not her. Time seemed to stand still in the hospital. I sat outside the emergency room, my fists clenched, praying for whoever could hear me. Doctors and nurses came and went with grim faces, and I held my breath every time the emergency room door opened. Finally, a doctor who introduced himself as Dr. Harris called me into a small room. He held a stack of test results, his voice low but clear. "Mr. Callahan, we've run the tests. Isa has acute myeloid leukemia." The ground beneath my feet disappeared again. Leukemia. The same disease that took Tiffany from me. It couldn't be. Not Isa. I shook my head as if I could change the truth. "You're wrong," I whispered. "Isa is only 5. She's healthy. She was running around this morning." But Dr. Harris looked at me with regretful eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Callahan. It's rare in children, but it's not impossible. We'll do everything we can." I felt like I was about to collapse right there. I wanted to smash something, to scream, but I just put my head in my hands and fought back the tears. Isa is my little girl. She didn't deserve this. Tiffany's final days came flooding back to me. The way he forced a smile, the way he held my hand even as his body faded day by day. How could I let Jesus go through the same thing? Dr. Harris continued, his voice sounding distant. "Isa needs a bone marrow transplant as soon as possible. This is her best chance. We'll test you to see if you're HLA compatible. If you're not, we'll scan your records." I nodded, but deep down, I knew how small our chances were. I remembered that finding a suitable donor was a race against time, and Tiffany and I had lost that race. I couldn't let that happen to Isa. I immediately signed the consent form for the test and sat by Isa's bedside, holding her hand as we waited for the results. Her tiny body lay in the hospital bed, IVs hooked up to her fragile arm. She opened her eyes and looked at me with a weak smile. "Dad, are we going to be here long?" she asked. I kissed her forehead, trying not to tremble in my voice. "Just a little, honey. Daddy will take you home soon." But I knew I was lying. The next day, the test results came back, and it hit me like a punch in the chest. I wasn't HLA compatible with Isa. Dr. Harris said it wasn't surprising that parents aren't always compatible, but I felt like I'd let him down. I was his father, but I couldn't save him. I registered Isa on the National Bone Marrow Donor Registry, hoping to find someone who might give him a chance. But the doctor warned me the process could take months, even years, and Isa didn't have that kind of time. The days that followed were a constant nightmare. Isa started chemotherapy, and every time I saw her hair fall out and her skin get thinner, it was like a piece of me was being torn away. She still tried to smile, talked about the princesses she dreamed of, but just like Tiffany's, I could see the light in her eyes fading. I stayed in the hospital every night, falling asleep in the hard chair next to her bed, praying for a miracle. But each day, the doctors brought worse news. There were no compatible donors on the registry. There were no matches on the waiting list. Isa's time was running out. I was on the verge of collapse. Some nights, I'd sit in the hospital parking lot, pounding the steering wheel, crying like a child. I was angry at life, at God, at myself. Why Isa? Why was fate so cruel? I thought about Tiffany's letter, her plea for Max. I had disappointed her, and now I was disappointing Isa. I pulled Max's faded photo from my wallet and looked into his gray eyes. "You were wrong to trust me, Tiffany," I whispered, as if he could hear. "I can't save anyone." But one night, as I sat at Isa's bedside, a nurse from the emergency room rushed in. "Mr. Callahan, you have to come with me. They just brought in a child. He has no one, but I think you need to see him. His eyes are just like your daughter's." At the nurse's words, my heart began to race for some reason I couldn't explain. I kissed Isa's forehead, whispered that I'd be right back, and followed her toward the emergency room, unaware that my life was about to change forever. The emergency room was chaotic, alarms blaring, nurses shouting, and the strong smell of antiseptic. Ellen, the nurse accompanying me, explained the situation as we walked. A truck driver found him exhausted on the side of the road. He had no identification, no family. Then she paused and looked at me. But his eyes were just like Isa's. I can't explain it, but I felt like there was a connection. My blood rushed to my head, the world felt cramped, eyes like Isa's. I didn't dare think any further, but my feet carried me down the hallway to a small room. Inside, on a bed with white sheets, lay a frail boy of about 9. His eyes were closed, his skin pale, his brown hair matted with sweat. An IV was hooked up to his arm, and the heart monitor beeped periodically. I froze in the doorway, unable to move. Then the boy opened his eyes. His gray eyes made my heart skip a beat. They were the same eyes as Tiffany's and Isa's. "That's the boy," Ellen said, placing her hand on my shoulder. "We're trying to reach Child Protection Services, but he's not saying much. He just said his name is Max." Max? The name rang in my mind like a bell. I held on to the wall to steady myself. It couldn't be. It was Max. The boy Tiffany had left behind, the boy I'd lost track of. Looking closer, I noticed the shape of his face, his slightly pointed chin, his thin lips, just like the young Tiffany I'd known in college. I pulled the photo out of my wallet and compared it. My hands were shaking. It was him, Max. I was sure of it. I turned to Ellen, my voice trembling. "I want a DNA test now." She nodded, asking no questions. It was as if she sensed she'd witnessed a momentous moment. As I waited, I sat at Max's bedside, watching him. He was so thin that his cheekbones bulged beneath his skin. His clothes were tattered and dirty. How had he survived, alone and alone? I found him, Tiffany, I thought. But why now, while Isa was fighting for her life a few floors up? The test results came back the next morning. I was sitting in Dr. Harris's office, holding on to the edge of the desk. He handed me a sheet of paper with a serious expression. "Max is Tiffany Callahan's son and Isa's half-brother. DNA confirms the relationship." I wasn't surprised, but a heavy wave still hit me in the chest. Max was Tiffany's son. The boy I was looking for was in this hospital, but under circumstances I never wanted. I returned to Max's room. He was awake. His gray eyes were filled with fatigue and fear, like a cornered animal's. "Who are you?" he asked hoarsely. I sat next to his bed, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm Clayton. I knew your mother." Max frowned, didn't say anything, but his eyes never left mine. I wanted to tell him about Tiffany, Isa, the letter, but I knew now wasn't the time. The next few days, I spent my time shuttling between Isa and Max's rooms. Isa was still weak, but she tried to smile whenever she saw me. "Dad, I dreamed about Mom today," she said once. She said I had to be strong. Tears flowed silently as I hugged her. Max remained silent, though. He was recovering quickly with medical care, but he kept his distance, giving short answers to my questions. I didn't blame him. A child like him had long since learned that the world wasn't a kind place. Then one morning, Dr. Harris called me into his office. His face was a mixture of hope and caution. "Clayton, we ran Max's HLA test for a possible bone marrow transplant for Isa. The results are extraordinary, a perfect match." I stood frozen, unable to believe my ears. A perfect match. This was practically a miracle for half-siblings. Hope ignited within me, but so did fear. Would Max agree? Would Isa be able to handle the transplant? With a heavy heart, I returned to Max's room. He was sitting on the bed, looking out the window. "Max," I began, my voice trembling, "you have a sister. Her name is Isa, and she's very sick. You're the only one who can save her." Max looked at me, his eyes filled with doubt. I told him about Isa, about Tiffany, about how this disease had stolen his sister's life. There was a long silence when I finished. Then, coldly, he said, "Why should I help? I don't know you or her." But I saw his eyes twitching, something fighting inside him. I left the room, giving him time to think. I prayed silently that he would understand, not just for Isa, but for himself as well. Tiffany had wanted him to be loved, to be part of a family. The days that followed were a test of patience. Max was distant, but I didn't give up. Every day I'd stop by his room and bring him an adventure book or a cup of hot chocolate I thought he might enjoy. I'd tell him about Tiffany. I told him how he sang lullabies, how much he loved children, and how he always carried a handkerchief in his pocket. Max listened, but didn't say anything. Once I noticed him glance furtively at the photo of Tiffany on the table, and his eyes softened, if only for a moment. I took Max to see Isa too. The first time he stood at the door, refusing to come in. Isa lay exhausted in bed, but when he saw me, he smiled. "Dad, who is he?" he asked, looking at Max. So as not to pressure him, I introduced him as a special friend. Max watched Isa silently from afar, then turned away. But I saw him standing in the hallway, his shoulders shaking slightly. I didn't know what he was thinking, but I hoped that somewhere deep down, he felt a connection to that little girl. Finally, one afternoon, as I was about to leave his room, Max called out. "Mr. Clayton," he said hesitantly, "if I get that test done, if I help him, you won't leave me, will you?" I looked at him, my heart clenching. This boy, no matter how tough he seemed, needed love. I knelt down beside him and put my hand on his shoulder. "Max, I promise you, no matter what happens, I won't leave you." He nodded, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of trust in his eyes. Max agreed to the official test, and the results were once again miraculous. He was the perfect donor for Isa. When I hugged him, all I could say was, "Thank you." Max just shrugged, but I saw the corners of his mouth turn up in a faint smile. The transplant was scheduled for the following week. As we waited outside the operating room, my hands clasped, I prayed with all my might. Both Max and Isa were inside, and I felt suspended somewhere between hope and despair. When Dr. Harris came out, he was beaming. The transplant was a success. Now all we have to do is wait and see how Isa's body responds. The days that followed were more miraculous than I could have ever imagined. My little girl Isa began to recover. The thinning hair she'd lost from chemotherapy hadn't yet grown back, but her gray eyes, just like those first days in Nashville, were shining again like a summer sun. The doctor told me Isa's body had accepted Max's marrow and that her blood count was improving every day. As I sat at her bedside, holding her hand, I felt the warmth of her tiny fingers, and for the first time in months, the heavy weight on my heart had eased. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the hospital curtains, Isa sat up in bed, a bright smile on her face. "Dad, I want to go out," she said, her voice still faint but clear. I looked at Dr. Harris, who was checking his chart. He nodded and smiled. "He can move slowly, but we'll use a wheelchair for safety." I wanted to cry, but instead I hugged Isa and kissed her forehead. "Okay, honey, Daddy's gonna take you for a walk." I wheeled Isa into the hospital garden. It was a small garden filled with golden daisies, shimmering in the sun. Max walked silently beside us, but his eyes never left his sister. Isa giggled and touched a flower. "Dad, these are just like the flowers my mom loves," she said, and in that moment I saw Max smile, a small but genuine smile. I looked at Isa, her face radiant, and Max, his gray eyes filled with emotion. At that moment, I thought life had given me a second chance. The following days were filled with rare moments of happiness I'll cherish forever. Isa was strong enough to take a few steps in her room or down the hallway. I loved sitting on a garden bench and reading her fairy tales about brave princesses, just like Tiffany. Max would join us, though he was shy at first. "I don't know how to tell fairy tales," he'd say, but Isa would tug at his hand pleadingly. "Tell me, Max, just one, please." Max would blush when I called him brother, but I could see his face soften. He'd clumsily begin to tell the story of a young knight searching for treasure. Isa would laugh and applaud with delight. "You tell stories better than my father," he'd tease, and I'd feign offense, making all three of us laugh. Max and Isa had become close. Some afternoons, I would find them sitting together in Max's hospital bed. Isa patiently taught Max how to hold a pencil while drawing princesses. One time, Isa had drawn a family of 4, me, Max, herself, and a woman with long brown hair. "That's my mom," she said, pointing to the figure. Max looked at the drawing for a long time, then nodded. "My mom is beautiful," he said softly. I turned away quickly, trying not to show them that my eyes were welling up with tears. I started bringing Isa's favorite treats to the hospital. Chocolate chip cookies, like Tiffany's, vanilla ice cream from the store near our old house in Nashville. Max, though he wouldn't say it, loved these treats. I'd watch him devour the cookies as if it were the first time he'd eaten something he hadn't scavenged from the trash. One time, Isa was sharing cookies with Max, saying, "You have to eat a lot to be strong like me." Max laughed, a real laugh, and somewhere I sensed Tiffany watching us with her gentle smile. These moments might not last forever, but they were more precious than anything I'd ever had. One evening I took Isa out to watch the sunset. Max came to us with an adventure book he'd taken from the hospital library. Isa lay on the bench, her head resting on my shoulder. Max sat next to us, reading aloud a story about a magical island. "Just like my name," Isa murmured. Max paused and looked at his sister with a tenderness I'd never seen before. "Yes," he said, "this island is special, just like you." Isa smiled, taking Max's hand, and my heart melted. In that moment, I wasn't a father battling fear, but a man experiencing happiness, no matter how fleeting. Max changed during those days, too. The boy who had once guarded himself against the world, believing there was no place for him in it, was slowly opening up. One night, as Isa slept soundly in bed, Max pulled me into the hallway. "Clayton," he said hesitantly, "I'm happy I helped Isa. I think my mom would be happy too." I put my hand on her shoulder, trying to keep my voice calm. "Your mom is proud of you, Max, so am I." He looked up at me, his gray eyes shining, and for the first time in his life, he hugged me. It was a strange, yet genuine embrace. As I held him, I felt the quiet strength of the boy who once wandered the streets alone. I had begun to imagine a future, however fragile. I dreamed of taking Isa and Max back to Bozeman, of hiking in the foothills, of reading by the fire in the evenings. I imagined Isa growing up healthy with Max by her side, of them sharing the stories Tiffany left behind. I knew these dreams might never come true, but in those days I allowed myself to hope. Still, there was a sense of unease. The doctors were monitoring Isa closely, and even though she was doing well, I could see fleeting flashes of concern in her eyes. One day, Dr. Harris called me into his office, his voice cautious. "Isa is responding well," he said, "but we need to closely monitor the risk of graft versus host disease. That's the biggest risk after a transplant." I nodded, but my heart felt heavy. I didn't want to think about it, didn't want to believe this happiness could slip away from me. I tried to savor every moment I had with Isa and Max. One afternoon, I threw a little party in Isa's room. Just cookies, ice cream, and a small speaker playing Tiffany's favorite song. Isa clapped and laughed, and Max shyly sang along. "Dad, Max sucks!" Isa teased. Max chased him around the room, feigning annoyance, and all three of us laughed until tears welled up in our eyes. In that moment, if only for a moment, my family was complete. But as I learned from Tiffany, happiness is always fragile. The bone marrow transplant initially brought hope, but then complications arose, like a sudden storm in a calm sky. One morning, Nurse Ellen rushed to me, pale as I was getting coffee in the waiting room. "Mr. Callahan, you need to come in now. Isa, she's not well." I dropped the paper cup and ran after her. In the room, Isa was struggling to breathe, her heart monitor beeping erratically. Doctors surrounded her, using medical jargon I couldn't understand, performing emergency procedures. I stood helplessly in the corner, watching my little girl fight for her life. Max was there too, standing silently in the doorway, his gray eyes wide with fear. Dr. Harris then explained that Isa had graft-versus-host disease, a rare but fatal complication in which her body rejects Max's bone marrow. "We're doing everything we can," she said, but her eyes couldn't hide her concern. "She's very weak. Clayton, you have to prepare yourself." "Prepare yourself?" How could I prepare to lose Isa now, when my whole world had already been shattered by Tiffany? I held Isa's hand and whispered words of encouragement, but deep down, I was begging for a miracle that would never come. The days that followed were a series of nightmares. Isa grew weaker, her fever rose, and the doctors tried everything: immunosuppressants, blood transfusions, anything to keep her by my side. I didn't leave the hospital, dozing in the chair next to her bed, waking only to a nurse tapping my shoulder or the alarm on the monitor. Max was there too, but he spoke very little. He sat in the corner, sometimes holding Isa's hand, sometimes just watching her from afar. I could see him trying to stay strong, but his eyes were filled with pain, as if he blamed himself for what had happened. One night, while Isa was sedated and asleep, Max pulled me into the hallway. "Clayton," he said, his voice trembling. "Why did this happen?" I gave him my marrow. I tried. He bowed his head, and his shoulders shook. He began to sob silently. I knelt beside him, pulled him into my arms, and for the first time I felt him completely let his guard down. "It's not your fault, Max," I said huskily. "You did your best. You gave Isa a chance." But deep down, I knew that chance was slipping through my fingers. Even though I wasn't religious at all, I began to pray. I begged God, Tiffany, anyone who would let Isa stay with us. But her condition worsened every day. She smiled less, spoke less, and her gray eyes, once bright like the summer sun, were now dull like the sky before a storm. I told her stories about her mother and how much Tiffany loved her. Isa would sometimes smile and listen, but I knew she was exhausted. Max changed during this time too. She started talking more, not just to Isa, but to me too. He once told me about his days on the streets, how he survived on scraps from dumpsters, how he slept in abandoned buildings. "I always thought my mother didn't want me," he said, his voice soft but filled with pain. "But now I realize she loved me in her own way." I hugged him, telling him that Tiffany had regretted leaving him all her life, that she wanted me to find her and love her like my own child. Max didn't cry, but he nodded, and I saw another part of that wall around his heart crumble. Then came the fateful night. I was sitting at Isa's bedside holding her hand when Dr. Harris walked in. He said nothing, just nodded sadly, and I understood. My heart seemed to stop. "No," I whispered. I hugged Isa, feeling her light breathing on my shoulder. "I love you," I said, my tears flowing uncontrollably. "You are my everything." Isa opened her eyes, smiled faintly. "I love you too, Dad," she whispered, and then closed her eyes. The heart monitor made a long, continuous beep. I don't remember whether I screamed or remained silent at that moment. I only remember Max rushing into the room in panic. He froze in place, looked at Isa, then burst into sobs. "She fought so hard," he said, his voice trembling. I held him in my arms and hugged both my children tightly. One had left me, and the other was here, suffering with me. We sat in the cold room, crying for Isa, for Tiffany, for everything we had lost. The days that followed were like a hazy dream. I decided to take Isa back to Nashville to sleep with her mother, under the oak trees in that small cemetery where we had said goodbye to Tiffany. I wanted her to be close to her mother because she always spoke of her in her dreams. The funeral was silent. Max stood beside me, holding my hand, not saying a word. I saw him place a picture on Isa's coffin, a picture of a princess in a field of flowers. "Goodbye, little sister," he whispered, and I knew how much he had loved her in that short time. The pain of losing Isa was like a wound that would never heal. But Max was my reason for going on. Tiffany's gray-eyed son was the last piece of her. I couldn't leave him alone. Not just because of the promise I'd made to Tiffany, but because I'd come to love her just as Isa did. We faced the pain together, step by step, and I knew this journey, no matter how painful, wasn't over yet. After burying Isa next to her mother, Max and I returned to Bozeman, where the majestic mountains stood silently like faithful companions. Our little house was emptier than ever. The couch where Isa had curled up to listen to my stories now bore a thin layer of dust. Her drawings on the refrigerator were still there, each one stuck like a needle in my heart. Max felt that emptiness too. He often sat by the window gazing out at the leafy road. His gray eyes were pensive, as if searching for something he couldn't place. The first months after Isa's death were a blur. Every morning I woke up, trying to go to work and take care of Max, but the pain followed me like a shadow. Some nights I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, imagining Isa's laughter coming from the next room. Max had his quiet moments too. He'd sit in the corner holding Isa's old rag doll. "She loved this," he said once, his voice soft but firm, as if he were trying to hold on to that memory. I knew we couldn't live in this grief forever. Tiffany had taught me that no matter how cruel life can be, we have to find a way to get back up. So Max and I began small steps to build a new life. I decided to redecorate Isa's room, not to erase her memory, but to honor her and Tiffany, to transform it into a space where we could look forward. Max and I painted the walls together. We chose a pale blue that Isa had once said was the color of the sky in her fairy tales. We built a small bookcase and filled it with Isa's favorite adventure books and a photo of Tiffany's gray eyes smiling brightly. Max hung the picture of a princess in a flower field that he and Isa had drawn on the wall. "My mom loved this place," he said, calling Tiffany Mom without hesitation for the first time. I hugged her, feeling a warmth in my heart. I also began the process of officially adopting Max. It was a challenging journey, filled with long meetings with the Child Welfare Agency and mountains of paperwork. Sometimes I feared they would reject me, thinking that a single father who had just lost his daughter couldn't care for a child with Max's complicated past. But every time I looked into Max's gray eyes, I remembered the promise I'd made to Tiffany and knew I couldn't break it. Max didn't believe I actually wanted to adopt him at first. One evening, as we were eating sandwiches in the kitchen, he asked, "Why are you doing this? I'm not your real son." I looked him in the eye, my voice firm. "Max, you're Tiffany's son. That makes you my son. I want you here because I love you." Max didn't say anything, but I saw his eyes light up. He nodded, and from that moment on, I knew he was starting to trust me. Max started school in Bozeman, and I was surprised at how quickly he adapted. Although still shy, he made friends, and I started seeing him smile more often. One day he came home from art class with a drawing, a family in the sky with a man, a boy, and 2 bright stars. "That's Mom and Jesus," he said, pointing to the stars. I hugged him, tears streaming down my face. "You're right, son," I said, calling him son for the first time without hesitation. From that day on, Max started calling me Dad, and I felt it was a small victory, a step forward in our journey. A year after Isa's passing, I felt it was time for Max and me to return to Nashville, to honor Tiffany and Isa, to tell them that we were okay, even if our pain hadn't gone away. I reached out to Isa's preschool friends, Sister Ellen, and a few people who knew our family. They agreed to attend a small memorial service at the cemetery, and knowing Tiffany and Isa were still remembered gave me some solace. The drive to Nashville was emotional. Max sat in the passenger seat, clutching Isa's rag doll tightly, his gray eyes staring out the window. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. Max nodded, but I saw his hands tighten around the doll. "I want to tell Mom and Isa I tried," he said, his voice quiet but firm. I placed my hand on his shoulder without saying anything, but I knew deep down that Tiffany would be proud of this child. The memorial service was held beneath the oak trees in the Nashville cemetery. As I laid a bouquet of white daisies on Tiffany's grave, Max placed a new picture of a princess and a boy standing side by side on Isa's. Nurse Ellen told stories about Tiffany, about how she brought joy to the children at her preschool. "Tiffany would have been so proud of you both," she said, looking at Max and me. Max held my hand, and I felt the quiet strength between his fingers. He didn't cry, but I saw his shoulders shake slightly, and I knew he, too, was learning to say goodbye. Here I am today in that cemetery. The soft autumn sun filtered through the oak trees, casting long beams across the ground. Max, now 13, stands beside me, his dark gray eyes reminding me every time I look at them of Tiffany, Isa, and the joys and sorrows of days gone by. Before us, two gravestones, one large, the other small, lie side by side, Tiffany and Isa. Their names are deeply etched into the stones. Tiffany Callahan, 1993-2019, Isa Callahan, 2017-2022. My wife and daughter, two lives that left me but left one last piece behind. That piece is Max. The cool autumn breeze envelops us, bringing the scent of dry leaves and the daisies I left on Tiffany's grave. Max holds tightly the old rag doll Isa hasn't left since her hospital days. He leans down and places it on Isa's headstone, his movements slow and gentle, as if afraid to disturb his sister. "This is for you, Isa," he whispers. His voice is so soft I have to lean in to hear it. I watch him silently, my heart clenching. Max rarely spoke at Isa's grave, but there's something different about him today. A calm peace, as if he's found a way to accept it. "Dad," Max says suddenly. His voice is soft but clear. I turn to him in surprise. It's the first time he's called me Dad. My heart skips a beat. I kneel beside him and look into his sparkling gray eyes. Tears fill my eyes, but I manage a smile. "Your mother would be so proud of you today," I say, unsure whether I'm saying this to Max, Tiffany, or myself. Max nods, the corners of his mouth quirk into a small smile, and in his eyes I see not just pain, but a glimmer of hope. I take Max's hand and lead him away from the cemetery. The path ahead is lined with golden leaves, bathed in the first rays of autumn sunlight. It seems to be guiding us toward a future I can't yet fully see. I don't know what the coming days will bring, or whether the wounds in our hearts will ever truly heal. But as I feel Max's small hand in mine, I know we've found each other in the midst of an irreparable loss. We've lost so much, Tiffany, Isa, the dream of being a complete family, but we found each other, and sometimes that's all it takes.